see. And finish this first part of the analysis of expectations. We're gonna jump to something slightly different but related today. Namely, last time we discussed mostly so-called adaptive expectations. We discussed what happens when macroeconomic policy is disturbed by people's expectations about the future, about the future inflation rate. And the concept that we encountered here was one of adaptive expectations introduced by Milton Friedman in Macroeconomics, that claim that the way how people react, the way how people form their expectations is by looking backwards, looking into the past for the clues about the future, and adapting their future behavior to whatever pattern or whatever logic, whatever correlation they discovered in the past. So if they observed over the last 6 months the inflation rate of 2%, they're going to project this expectation into the future. They will expect that 2% inflation rate in the next year. So that's adaptive expectation, which is not active, which is passive, which requires a passage of time, which is slower, which means you need to accumulate certain knowledge, to accumulate experience in order to revise your expectations. 6 months, 1 year, 3 months, whatever time period you choose. People do not change their expectations about the future inflation rate so easily. And we've seen that this has, even this relatively modest revision affects the efficiency of macroeconomic models greatly. It messes up the ability to conduct monetary policy and even fiscal policy, for that matter. This individual psychological element changes the ways how monetary policy works. That monetary policy may be the key conclusion is that it may be efficient in the short term, but not in the long. Then we're going to move forward. Right? So this is Milton Friedman's version of theory of expectation. University of Chicago professor of economics who got the Nobel Prize for a variety of things, including this theory, not primarily for this theory. A new wave of theorizing about expectations was launched by a brilliant student of Milton Friedman's named Robert Lucas Jr. Who eventually got his own Nobel Prize in 1981, I believe, primarily for his vision of the theory of expectations and the influence that this revision has for macroeconomic policy. He formulated something that we can call theory of rational expectations. And launched what came to be known later on a new classical macroeconomics. So today we're going to be talking about this new classical macroeconomics stemming from Robert Lucas and based primarily, mostly on his novel theory of rational expectations. Classical here being opposed to Keynesian. And new, meaning it's a new version, 1970s onwards. Classical economics was the dominant paradigm before Keynes came along in the 1930s, 1940s. Then Keynesianism becomes the dominant theory, and then once again, classical macroeconomics, new classical macroeconomics. That revise the two crucial principles of classical macroeconomics, which is free market friendly type of economic theorizing. First, markets are efficient. Markets efficient. And as a corollary of that, one crucial aspect of that, prices and wages are flexible. This is a reference. Flexible here is contrary to sticky wages, sticky prices, inflexible prices in Keynesianism. Remember this theory that when demand for goods and services goes down, then the wages are very slow to adjust. They're fixed by the long-term contracts, so the wages and prices do not change as quickly as we would want them to do in response to the changes in supply and demand. So these two are kind of interrelated. Because market efficiency, a crucial part of market efficiency is how quickly and how precisely market prices and wages, as important types of prices, adjust to the changes in the conditions of supply and demand. Okay, now let's go back to the concept of rational expectations. What is the difference between rational and adaptive expectations? The key difference is that rational expectations involve continuous, up-to-date, everyday changes in what you expect is going to happen. It's not based only on past experience. It's based, or they are based, rational expectations, on the best available knowledge based on the totality of information. It's forward-looking, it's prospective. It's not based only on past experiences. You just don't you don't extrapolate past experiences into the future. You adapt and change and revise your expectations based on the totality of knowledge that you can derive about what is going to happen in the future. It's an active game of trying to predict what's going to happen. It's an active process. Rational means simply deriving as much information as possible in the present as a basis for predicting the future. And the past is only one of the past experiences. It's just only one variable that you use. Other variables are your knowledge about how the economic system works, the clues that the monetary authorities are giving. So you want to predict the future inflation rate as best as possible. In both cases, you want to predict future inflation rate. The difference is how you go about it. Now, you may say, okay, but who can do this? Everybody can extrapolate from the past. That's not so difficult after all. But to have some specific knowledge about the workings of the monetary system and the details of monetary policy and of all other factors that may influence the future price level, that's just in purview of a narrow band of experts who know much about that. Most normal people don't have any clue about that. That's correct, but some people do know. Some people have a certain type of knowledge about it. And economic agents who have a vested interest in correctly predicting inflation will hire the services of those people. So who might have an interest in correctly predicting inflation? Can you give me a couple of examples? What the inflation rate is going to be in the next year? Economic agents might want to know who pays some money to know the precise, correct prediction of inflation. Do the banks like to know the inflation rate? Why? Workers. So when a bank gives a loan, interest rate has three components. And one of those components is inflation rate. So the nominal interest rate that you charge contains compensation for risk, default risk, the risk that the borrower will not pay back the loan. The time preference compensation, you're waiting for money for 1 year, so you get compensation for that. And inflation rate compensation. So if the inflation rate is 3%, it's expected to be 3% next year, and the real interest rate is 6%, the nominal interest rate will be 9%. So it would be very convenient if you could know exactly what the inflation rate will be, then you can index your nominal interest rates that you chart right now. You are not in risk of losing money if you correctly anticipate the inflation rate. Workers, the same thing applies to workers. You get the same nominal income, and to negotiate for your wages, it's very good for you in the negotiations about wages. You know what is the expected inflation rate, what inflation rate is likely to be next year. That's why the trade unions are hiring economists who study the trends in economic policy, trying to figure out those things. So the key difference here is that adaptive expectations are based only on the past experience and are slow to move, and rational expectations are based on the totality information from the present, from the past, and from every knowledge that you might have about the future. So then, any change in the information, past and present, or about the future, changes the expectations. So most people wouldn't know anything about it, but if they have a motive, they can learn about it from a minority of people who has some knowledge. That's the reason that the argument that most people are not familiar with the workings of the monetary and economic system is not an argument against rational expectations.
So how does monetary policy affect like loanable funds, like the quantity of loanable funds?
Oh, it depends. It depends what kind of monetary policy you discuss that. If you expand, in principle, if you expand the money supply, the quantity of loanable funds is expected to increase. The interest rate is expected to drop for a while. If you have a contractionary monetary policy, which means you reduce the money supply, then the interest rate is going to increase. So this is the market for loanable funds. This is interest rates, it's the price of money. This is the quantity of funds. This is the demand for loans. It's commercial and the consumer loans, the business consumer loans, and this is the supply of money. If you have expansionary monetary policy, it will result in an increase in money supply. You expand the money supply. So other things being equal, so this is the equilibrium interest rate before you conduct monetary policy. This is the equilibrium quantity of credit, of loanable funds that will be exchanged between lenders and borrowers. The supply of credit increases when the supply of money increases, so then interest rate goes down. Your equilibrium interest rate is lower, and the quantity of credit is greater. And vice versa. If you contract the money supply, you shift the supply curve back to the left, the interest rate increases, and quantity of credit decreases. Okay, so monetary policy here is the tool that you use to stabilize the economy. And the question is, how do the rational expectations affect this policy? And the conclusion is a dismal one for macroeconomics. You'll see that one of the consequences of adaptive expectations If true, they would render monetary and fiscal policy ineffective in the long run. In the short run, you can create a little bit more prosperity, a little bit of higher productivity at the price of higher inflation, but in the long run, you're on your own. Only the real factors influence. If rational expectations were correct, the final conclusion is a dismal one because you cannot do anything, even in the short run. That's Lucas's conclusion. Eventually, that kind of so much alarmed the macroeconomic establishment because it kind of suggested that everything that they've been teaching and doing and prophesizing for decades was impossible. If people can predict what you're going to do with interest rates and money supply and credit supply, they're going to adjust preemptively in advance, and it will not have effect whatsoever on macroeconomics. We'll see in due course how this works in practice, how this works in detail. But that's the bottom, the bottom line, top line conclusion here. Top line conclusion here is: if rational expectations are efficient, if people are very good in guessing what's going to happen with monetary or fiscal policy, those policies will be highly ineffective. That's a top line conclusion that you can just circle in. Now, the question is to what extent this is the case, to what extent people correctly predict future inflation rate. That's a different kettle of fish. Okay, but first, there's an intermezzo here, a small technical point before we move to this analysis, what happens when rational expectations are complete or incomplete. First, what happens to the one variable that we are always interested in? How changes in expectations about the future consumer prices affect productivity, short-run aggregate supply. How the expectations about the changes in price level affect productivity of the economy. On the supply side of our market. And then we will introduce the demand side, changes in monetary policy, changes in the aggregate demand, and see what are the properties of the macroeconomic equilibrium, short run and long run, here as compared to Keynesianism and as compared to monetarism. Okay. So here, first about the supply curve. This is the well-known diagram for macroeconomic theory. That's the supply curve. This is a regular short-run supply curve, initial one. Imagine now that people have the expectation that the price level will increase. What is going to happen to the short-run supply, according to the theory of rational expectations? One more technical point here is how much people will work in the present will depend not on their nominal wages, how much money on paper they have, but rather on their assessment of the real value of purchasing power of that money, of the real wage. So the real wage could be calculated, the real wage depending on price. It's a nominal wage. That's the amount of money that you receive on paper. Or in reality, nominal, whatever, $55,000 in current prices. Over expected price level, minus 100. This is a correction of the nominal wage for the effects of inflation. So if the price level is expected to increase, the real wage will go down. Okay, so you see the price level in the denominator here will increase. When you divide the same number with a larger number, the result will be lower. So the real wage is inversely correlated to the changes in price level. Increased price level leads to lower real wages, and decreased price level leads to higher wages. Okay, that makes sense. If there is inflation, the same dollar that you have can purchase less goods and services than before. So whatever you wage, the purchasing power of that wage, the quantity of goods and services that you could buy for that wage will be lower. So then the CPI goes up, the price level goes up, expected price level goes up. Right. Emphasize. What happens to present behavior? If they expect that the price level is going to increase, they're going to work less. So real wages go down, people work less. People work less means less goods and services will be produced. Less output of production. Less output technically means the short-run supply curve shifts to the left. This is what happens. Short-run supply curve 2 is a curve that obtains once this described sequence here happens in reality. Increased expectations about the future inflation lead to lower expected real wages. Lower expected real wages lead people to work less right now. You expect that your money will be worth less tomorrow, you work less right now. That's the catch. This is a temporal. Right. So this is the future is influencing the present. That's one of the mind-boggling elements of economics that you will have to adjust yourself. That sometimes or very often the future is what contrary to physics and physical causation. Here, the future influences the present. The future happenings, hypothetical, speculative events in the future influence your current behavior. So people work less right now because they expect lower wages and higher prices in the future. This is the cause. This is the effect. Effect precedes its cause in time. That's the weirdness of all of this. And this is just the movement of the supply curve. It's just a technical depiction of this. The opposite happens, of course, if people expect the price level to drop. That means that they expect that the real wages will be higher in the future. That means they're going to work right now more. That means they're going to produce right now more. That means that the short-run current supply curve will shift the other way. Okay. So this is the short-run supply curve 3, representing expectations of the declining price level. Correlated to declining price level, and this one is correlated with the increased price level. Okay, so declining price level, higher real wages, working more, producing more output, supply curve shifting to the right. At every given price level, people will be producing more because they will be working more. Any questions thus far? So this is the mechanism, how the supply works. Now we'll have to match this to demand. And who is responsible for demand? Government. to monetary or fiscal policy. Aggregate demand, of course, not aggregate demand. In order to understand the equilibrium, you need both supply and demand factors. Now, rational expectations. That's all well and good, but whether expectations are correct or not, that's the question. So now we have to analyze what is going to happen to the macroeconomic equilibrium if expectations are correct, and what is going to happen if they are incorrect in either direction. So the first possibility is that CPI expectations, expected changes in CPI, expected inflation rate, is equal to actual CPI or realized CPI. So you expect the inflation to increase 3% in the next year, and it indeed increases 3%. So that's one case in which you have a successful prediction, successful anticipation. Expectations match the reality. Now, what is going to happen, and we'll see that in just a second what are the consequences and ramifications of that for macroeconomic equilibrium and for macroeconomic policy. The second possibility is that the expected CPI, expected inflation, was greater than the realized or actual. All this expectations are biased upward bias. That means we expected inflation to be 5%, but it is only 3%. How is that different? How does that affect macroeconomic equilibrium and policy differently than the previous case? And the third case is that expected CPI was smaller than the one achieved, actually. So this is the downward bias. That means we expected 3% inflation rate, it was 5%. And the final possibility might be that there were no expectations whatsoever. No expectation changes. People expected the same thing to happen that was happening before. We'll see how these three are primary, but we will see also some interesting observations about the fourth case here and how does it compare to the previous ones. So let's start with the first one. Okay, I'll still erase this. Now we have this macroeconomic equilibrium we're familiar with from the beginning. This is our long-run supply curve. And let's say that we have the aggregate demand curve at the beginning and the short-run supply curve at the beginning. This is our macroeconomic equilibrium point 1. And now what happens here? What happens is this sequence people expect the price level to increase and they correctly guess how much it will increase. Okay, how much the price level will increase? Let's say that this is the new demand curve. After the government conducted a round of monetary stimulus or fiscal stimulus, it doesn't matter what it was, the aggregate demand curve was shifted, the new equilibrium point will be here. So this is the initial price level here. This is the new price level CPI2. It doesn't matter how the aggregate demand curve is shifted. One important point to understand here that this analysis of rational expectations is usually conducted within the framework of monetary policy, but it applies equally to fiscal policy. Why is that the case? It's very simple. What is aggregate demand? We can calculate it in two different ways. Remember, nominal spending, N times V from Fisher's equation of exchange. Money supply times velocity of circulation equals price times quantity. So we define that this term on the left-hand side of the equation is aggregate demand, is total amount of spending. That's a monetary depiction of the aggregate demand. What is the fiscal expression of aggregate demand? Anyone else? Come on. What's fiscal? Spending. Another formula. C plus I plus G plus NX. So C plus I plus G plus NX equals N times V. That's the same thing. So that means you can change aggregate demand by changing any of the terms of this fiscal equation, for example, government spending. Aggregate demand curve will shift, right? Or you can increase the money supply, expansionary monetary policy, the same thing with total spending. So that's the reason why it doesn't matter. The theory is completely neutral. It could be applied to both monetary and fiscal policy. It doesn't matter. So this is the new inflation rate. And people expected this inflation rate to happen. What the previous sequence has told us. How are they going to behave? We expect inflation to increase by 10%. We reduce, that means that we expect our real wages will decline 10% year over year. That means we're going to reduce working 10%. Purchasing power money will not 10%. We're going to reduce working 10%. Productivity of the economy will decrease 10%. Output will decrease 10%. The supply curve will shift to the left to this point here. Supply curve moves. Those two processes, monetary and fiscal policy stimulus, and the shift back of the supply curve happen in the same time. That's the key. In Friedmanite version of this, you stimulate the economy, or in the Keynesian view, the aggregate demand. And poor suckers, they believe, that everything is okay, they work more, but they don't reduce the number of labor hours. And you have this intermediate step here, when you have a higher price level, but also higher productivity. In the short run, you can buy a slight increase in productivity at the price of slightly higher inflation. But here, everything happens simultaneously. Here you don't have a correct anticipation of the future inflation rate. That's the reason why some people keep working for a while, although it doesn't make sense for them to work because they're losing money. The real wages are going down and they work the same hours. In the monetarist view, you can deceive some people temporarily. Here you cannot deceive them even in the short run. If they correctly guess the future inflation rate, they're not going to work. They're going to reduce their labor hours from the get-go. So this shift of the demand curve to the right and the shift back to the left of the supply curve happens simultaneously. Once the monetary stimulus works its way through the system, the adjustment downward in the supply will happen, and nothing will change. The point 2 here will be the same productivity, long-term productivity in the economy at a higher price level. So that means that monetary policies absolutely and fiscal policies are absolutely important even in the short term. If people correctly, in this particular case, if people correctly guess or predict the future inflation rate, what happens? So you get this. The key here is the difference between this situation and what we analyzed before in the context of adaptive expectations. And those shifts of the demand and supply curves here are synchronous. They happen in the same time. Whereas in the first model, in adaptive expectations, they're asynchronous. First, an increase in demand happens, creating a slight inflationary gap. And then this inflationary gap is eliminated by recession, by the economy adjusting, by people working less and producing less. Here, the whole process goes in the same time, and we never experience this point here. Just price level moves smoothly from one point to another, and productivity doesn't increase at any point. Because people are smart, they guess correctly that prices are going to increase. They're not going to work more for less money. What if people overshoot the target? If they overestimate the degree of inflation? Okay. CPI Q, the same on the curve. You have the aggregate demand curve 1. You have the supply curve 1. Okay, this is the initial point. Okay. So now we're going to have two different new aggregate demand curves. One aggregate demand curve showing the actual inflation rate. What happened, how much aggregate demand increased in reality. Let's say that this is that curve. Actual. So the actual inflation rate here, the CPI will be, initially will be here, okay? The intersection of the three curves, that's the equilibrium. Here the new equilibrium between long run curve and short run curve will be here. CPI 2. Then the correct supply curve of this price level will be which one? If people correctly predicted, guessed the inflation level, where the supply curve would be, the matching corresponding supply curve for aggregate demand 2. As the point to which the supply curve would have to go.
Moving back up to the left for that, yeah.
Here, yeah, exactly. So this is the correct supply curve 2. If people predicted successfully what happened. But that didn't happen. People didn't predict, right? What was the prediction? Here, the inflation rate, expected inflation rate, was higher. Higher than that. And they adjusted their real wages, they expected real wages, and their work hours more than it was optimal. So the actual supply curve that materialized is not the one that was socially optimal here, the supply curve number 2, but the supply curve that goes through this term, macroeconomic equilibrium here. Supply curve 3. Okay? Because this is the aggregate demand curve, this is the long run curve, this is the supply curve. This is how much people reduce their labor hours. And they should reduce it this much. So they overdid it. Since they overestimated the future inflation rate, they decreased their labor hours too much. They were afraid that their real wage will drop more than it actually did. Now, what is it? Can anyone tell me now, what is the new short-term macroeconomic equilibrium in this situation? What is the point? After the adjustments take place. So, we've seen what is the aggregate, short-run aggregate supply curve. That's this line. The long-run supply curve is the same. So what is the third component that we need to define the equilibrium? First, short-run equilibrium. Where is the aggregate demand curve? Which one applies here? 2 or 3? Which one is the actually realized? 2 actually. So now, strangely, here the short-run macroeconomic equilibrium is the intersection of this very pessimistic leftward tilted supply curve and the middle demand curve. Aggregate demand curve number 2, this is your equilibrium. The demand curve that really happened and the supply curve that really materialized. What can you tell me about this short-term equilibrium? Of course, we know that the short-term equilibrium cannot stand like this. It will have to go back to the long-run curve. But in the short run, what can you tell me about this situation? How is the economy doing here?
Is that a recession?
Yeah, recession. Of course, recessionary gap. Because this is the optimal level of productivity. This is recessionary gap. Q1 is greater than Q1. It's a recessionary gap. So the conclusion here is that if the rational expectations are imprecise in the upward direction, if people overestimate the price level change, this will lead to a temporary recession again, a temporary recession. What's going to happen next? There is a recession now. What happens next? People now realize that their real wages are actually higher than they believe they were. What they do is that they expect, or that they realize that they're higher. They start working more, produce more. Eventually, supply curve shifts to the right. And here we go back. So eventually, we end up in the same point where we would have been had a price level change been correctly predicted, but we just need this intermediary step. We have a short temporary recession as a price of this incorrect prediction. And I don't need now to tell you that the opposite happens if you underestimate the price level change. I try to draw it very, very quickly. Nice. So you have the aggregate demand curve 1. This is the initial equilibrium of somebody wrote in homework SARS curve. You know what SARS is? It's a coronavirus. Okay. So SARS curve and AD curve. And then you have the aggregate demand curve number 2. No, let's say this number 3, expected one. Is here, but the actually realized one, aggregate demand curve 2, is higher. So the price level increase was higher. Okay, let's simplify. 2 and 3 was higher than expected. What happens then? That means that expected reduction in supply, expected new supply curve that really people really create this supply curve too. Okay. Because they expected the price increase from 81 to 82. If their predictions were correct, then the supply that they needed to provide would be the one represented by this curve. And that's the level of supply that the economy provided in the short term. And it would have been fine had the aggregate demand curve were this intermediate one. But that was not the case. The true aggregate demand curve was the upper curve, a higher curve here because the inflation rate was higher. So then what is the new short-term macroeconomic equilibrium? Here, a truly realized supply curve and a truly realized demand curve. Where is this point? It's here. This is the real demand curve. People underestimated the price level rise. This was the real price increase. This was the estimate or expected. This was then the aggregate demand curve that people expected to materialize. This is the one that actually happened. The real supply reduction should have been much higher. So the real supply curve should have shifted all the way back here. Completely equilibrium, but it didn't. This is the new short-term equilibrium. Inflationary gap. You have overproduction in the short run. So now what people will do now? So inflationary gap results. As a consequence of the inflationary gap, people realize that their real wages are lower than they expected them to be, so they reduce labor hours. As a consequence of the reduction of work, less production will happen, and the supply curve will shift to the left. And the final resting point of the economy will be here. That's exactly where the resting point, the equilibrium point, would have been had the price change been correctly predicted. So, overestimate of the price level will lead to recessionary gap, and underestimate of the price level change will lead to inflation. In the first case, an increase in production will result. In the second case, recession. Any final questions? Okay, we'll come back to this. We'll begin with an overview, brief overview of this information. Move on.
Yeah.